So let's take a look, and a final look, at the meditations, meditation 6, and let's concentrate here on what he says in the very first sentence. There now only remains the inquiry as to whether material things exist. That's what we have to focus on, because that really is the last piece of the puzzle that he has to put together. And I think that helps us concentrate on what's going on in this meditation, but also keep in mind that he doesn't just want to prove, actually, that material things exist. That wouldn't be enough. He wants to prove not only that he knows they exist, but he can know something about them. That is, to know simply that there is a material world, that's great, in fact. That's a big thing. That's a big advance from that stance of radical, complete doubt that he was at in Meditations 1 and 2. But surely we would like to know more about the material world than its bare existence. We would like to know that the so-called seeming information that we receive through our senses about particular material things is actually reliable. He continues, with regard to this question, I at least know with certainty that such things may exist, insofar as they constitute the object of the pure mathematics, since regarding them in this aspect I can conceive them clearly and distinctly. That is, insofar as the material world consists of extension, number, motion, those abstract things, he has concluded in Meditation 5, he does know clearly and distinctly. That is, that he knows that mathematics, in its various forms, gives truth. So, insofar as the material things of the world display mathematical features, their basic fundamental features like extension and number and motion, you can probably conclude that they exist. But the first thing he talks about in Meditation 6 really is his faculty of imagination. Now, he says that when he conceives of a triangle, he does not just conceive of it barely in terms of thinking, but he also has the power of imagination. That is, he can imagine a triangle. He says at the bottom of page 151, and to render this quite clear, I remark in the first place the difference that subsists between imagination and pure intellection or conception. For example, when I imagine a triangle, I not only conceive that it is a figure comprehended by 3 lines, but at the same time also I look upon these 3 lines as present by the power and internal application of my mind, and this is what I call imagining. This power of imagination that he finds within himself is really, I think, the key to his establishing, finally, that material things, particular material things that we know through our senses, actually do exist. A little bit lower on page 152, he says, thus I observe that a special effort of mind is necessary to the act of imagination, which is not required to conceiving or understanding, and this special exertion of mind clearly shows the difference between imagination and pure intellection. I remark besides that this power of imagination which I possess, insofar as it differs from the power of conceiving, is in no way necessary to my nature or essence. That is, he could exist without imagination. He couldn't exist without thinking as a thinking thing, but he could imagine himself existing without imagination, the power to visualize, the power to conceive of an image, you might say. For although I did not possess it, I should still remain the same that I now am, from which it seems we may conclude that it depends on something different from the mind. That is, he seems to be saying that the power of imagination implicates something different from the mind in a way that intellection or pure conceptual thought does not. And I easily understand that if some body exists with which my mind is so conjoined and united as to be able, as it were, to consider it when it chooses, it may thus imagine corporeal objects, so that this mode of thinking differs from pure intellection only in this respect, that the mind, in conceiving, turns in some way upon itself. That is, when we pure intellect, pure reasoning, and considers some one of the ideas it possesses within itself. But in imagining, it turns outward towards the body, and contemplates in it some object conformed to the idea which it either of itself conceived or apprehended by sense. I easily understand, I say, that imagination may be thus formed if it is true that there are bodies. And because I find no other obvious mode of explaining it, I thence, with probability, conjecture that they exist, these corporeal bodies, but only with probability. And although I carefully examine all things, nevertheless I do not find that, from the distinct idea of corporeal nature I have in my imagination, I can necessarily infer the existence of any body. So, he has imagination. It would seem that imagination does implicate something that it imagines, something beyond the mind. But he cannot say with certainty that those external things, those objects, exist. He can only say with probability. Now here, I think, is where God comes in again. He says on page 156, about two-thirds of the way down the page, well, about halfway down the page, he says, "And to these grounds of doubt, I shortly afterwards also added two others of very wide generality. The first of them was that I believed I never perceived anything when awake, which I could not occasionally think I also perceived when asleep. And as I do not believe that the ideas I seem to perceive in my sleep proceed from objects external to me, I did not any more observe any ground for believing this of such as I seem to perceive when awake. The second was that since I was as yet ignorant of the author of my being, God, or at least supposed myself to be, I saw nothing to prevent my having been so constituted by nature as that I should be deceived even in matters that appeared to me to possess the greatest truth." And then on top of page 157 he says, "But now that I begin to know myself better and to discover more clearly the author of my being, I do not indeed think that I ought rashly to admit all which the senses seem to teach, nor, on the other hand, is it my conviction that I ought to doubt in general of their teachings." That is, God is not a deceiver. Descartes later says things like, well, I know I'm not perfect, and that is a problem because God's perfect and He created me. But He created me as the kind of being who could make errors, but he suggests later on, Descartes suggests, that He doesn't make me prone to any errors that I cannot correct through my own resources. Moreover, I have a natural inclination, that I have a natural urge, there's a natural sort of, I don't know exactly what he calls it, a natural urge to believe certain things. And he identifies, at a certain point in Meditation 6, you'll see, God with nature. So if I have a natural urge, it's an urge that God gave me. Which does not mean that I will always be perfect and that I should always follow out these natural urges. I should always use my criterion of clarity and distinction. However, I can't totally mistrust them, and if I have a natural urge to believe that my imagination and senses are actually in touch with objects that are external to me, then I have no reason to doubt that fundamental disposition to believe that. But we should not forget that ultimately, it's only the existence of God that guarantees that these natural urges, this natural disposition to believe in the reality of physical things can be trusted. If God does not exist, then Descartes' argument at this point actually falls apart. But where do we end up at the end here? Again, we end up with a very certain grasp of certain things, and those things are all mental things. They have to do with my own existence, my existence as a thinking thing, my knowledge of God as a perfect being who has no physical aspect to Him. I end up with knowledge of things like number and motion and extension and ratios and all the things, all the general truths of mathematics that apply to extension. And I end up with a probable knowledge of both the external world's very existence and the kind of information about particular external things that I seem to get. One more on this and then we'll be done.